Welcome to Life on Earth. Welcome to Life on Earth.
Well, welcome to Life on Earth, a special episode of Life on Earth. A little bit later start than usual in order to accommodate a very special guest. You know, we've said we were going to do more interviews on the show. You want to talk to more people than just us. And this is our opportunity to make that happen. We are happy, honored to have Dr. Amesh Adalja on the program.
We're very honored. Thank you for joining us, Amesh.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Oh my goodness, it's a dream come true. You know, we first met, I think, back in Ocon in Pittsburgh, I do believe, in the heyday of non-pandemicness, and you had expressed interest in coming to our Great Lakes Objectivist Conference or GLOCON, and then we exchanged some communication back and forth. That was our first time meeting you, and not only that, but so I am very pleased to have you on with us here on Life on Earth. Welcome to Earth. And I just want to say that we are all proud of you. Robert and I are super proud of you, and you should have several parades in your honor. And for all that you've been through in the last 2 years and all of your work and amazing efforts. But we're not going to necessarily talk about COVID questions today.
Do they have awards for putting up with stuff?
I think that you should definitely win an award for putting up with stuff. Yes.
So when Amy said, yeah, I want to talk to Amesh. I said, oh, you want to talk to Dr. Adalja? No, I want to talk to Amesh. I want to have a conversation. Well, you've talked to everybody about the pandemic, everything that's going on, and obviously there's going to be more to say. I've encouraged people to listen to the conversation you had with Kira Peikoff, which was outstanding. And I know you tweeted about that this morning, so I'm sure a lot of people have heard it. But no, Amy said, no, I want to talk to Amesh. I want to have a conversation like we did at Ocon. Man, was Ocon 2021 great.
Yes. So we have about a half an hour here with you tonight, and we just have some questions.
Yeah, I'll let you lead off. I have to technical issue.
Okay, very good. So Robert's doing a technical issue, but first of all, I just wanted to ask you the penultimate question. How did you discover Ayn Rand and objectivism, or how did you get involved in really enjoying philosophical issues or ideas as such?
So I would say that I've always been interested in ideas since I was a little kid. I was interested in that type, in being in scholarly work and thinking about ideas and thinking about big things and big questions. I would say that, so the first time I probably remember hearing about Ayn Rand might have been in, I think my AP English classes in high school, where there was a poster for the Fountainhead Essay Contest, which I didn't enter, but I remember somebody else entering it and talking about it. And I'd heard the name before. And then shortly thereafter, basically a year after graduating high school, I just had rapid succession exposures, meaning I was in someone's house and I just noticed a book on the shelf, or I was reading a magazine article about a celebrity and the name was mentioned, or I was sitting, on the subway and seeing somebody read it. And it just happened in rapid succession around the summer of 1994. So that said, then I kind of thought I probably this is something interesting. I want to see what it is. So I went and picked up kind of the first book I read, and I was in New York City that summer, and then I came home and I told my dad that I was reading this, and then he said, well, there's some books downstairs, and there was a copy of Atlas Shrugged on his shelf and a copy of Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. So I had all of that sort of sitting in my house since I was a baby, basically, probably since I was 1975 when I was born. So then I read that and I kind of devoured a lot of that during college. And as soon as there was a way to get involved, I started to get involved. I filled out one of those postcards that used to be in the books in the 1990s and mailed it in. And I started on the mailing list and started going to conferences and did all of that kind of in the 1990s until I ended up at medical school. And then it was a little bit rougher to get the time to go to all of that. But so that's my story.
So you came across that mid 90s, now 25, 27 years ago, and you were attending conferences in the 90s?
Yeah, I was. I started, I think at that time I was staying a lot in New York. I was in New York a lot. And there was a lot of activity there. So there was this New York Objectivist Club that had a lot of events and lectures with people like Harry Binswanger or Andy Bernstein. And at that time also was when ARI started to have certain conferences. Like that was around the time of Ayn Rand's Sense of Life coming out. So there was, I think that was one of the first things I went to, was a big meeting or a big conference that they had one day just about that, where people like Mike Berliner, Richard Ralston, Michael Paxton all gave lectures. And then I started to just go to whatever was available. And Lyceum was pretty big at that time as well. So there was lots of conferences that were on weekends, and I had a lot of frequent flyer miles from my parents, and they thought it was a really productive activity. So they say, just go. I went to lots of those weekend conferences. And then I think my first real major conference was the one in Irvine, I think in 1997, I believe it was. And that was big. And I also went to the one in Brussels, Belgium too. I forgot what year that was, in the 1990s as well.
I'm so happy that your parents were encouraging you of reading Ayn Rand.
I wish more of us had that.
That you went to the basement, you found your birthright. That's
yeah, it wasn't as if they encouraged me to read that. They encouraged me to read whatever it was. If I would have picked up a bunch of Nathaniel Hawthorne books and got obsessed, they would say that's a good thing. It's a productive activity. So that's kind of how they looked at it.
No, just that they were willing to give their miles to have you go to conferences. They could tell that you were enjoying it.
Yeah, that's
Most
fantastic.
excellent.
Yes. Next question, Robert, or do you want to?
No, you go right ahead.
Okay, so I mean, in terms of so I look past and I should let the audience know that your work in epidemiology spans far before COVID-19. And I saw an interview. I read an interview online in 2016 where you were talking about the Zika virus, and they were doing a really nice interview of you, and you were talking about why you got into epidemiology and the study of infectious diseases, and how you really loved to think of yourself as a detective. Is
there a short version of that story? What was it that got you interested in your field?
So both my parents are doctors, so I was always exposed to medical stuff. And I think the earliest thing that maybe if there's an origin story is that my favorite book growing up there's a book called The Value of Believing in Yourself, the story of Louis Pasteur. And it's a book about the discovery or the development of the second vaccine, the rabies vaccine. And that it's very simplified for children, but I got really fascinated by this idea of vaccines and antibodies and this battle between the immune system and a virus. And that was always sort of in the back of my head. And then also in the 1980s, growing up, my mom is a pulmonary doctor, or a lung doctor. She was taking care of some of the first HIV patients. And I can remember I think maybe in 6th, 7th grade, around that time, thinking that I'm going to do that, or I know that I'm going to there's something about this virus and HIV and all of that was really fascinating to me. I was just thinking about it, probably a little bit too much for a child, but I was thinking about it. And so that was kind of there as well. And then I actually went to college, and I was double majoring in biology and in business and finance type stuff. And I ended up dropping the biology part of it and trying to do a little bit of finance for about 6 months. I graduated college pretty young. I was only 19. So I had some time, and I was a 19-year-old living in New York City. That's around that time when I ran into the Ayn Rand books, but I started to think I wasn't being challenged enough. I was really interested in medicine, and I knew that I was going to go into infectious disease because that was all I really liked. I liked all the detective work and solving puzzles and figuring things out. And I liked the fact that with infectious disease, it's not just some narrow thing, as we've seen with this pandemic, that infectious diseases cascade and impact every aspect of life, from economics to sociology to politics to industry. All of that touches infectious disease in a way that most other specialties don't. So that's kind of why I think why I picked it, why I think it's the coolest and most satisfying aspect of medicine. But I think it's always been something in my head, and I still like, Sherlock Holmes stories, or, reading about criminal profilers, figuring out how a crime, all of that type of thing is really common between infectious disease and kind of the detective world. So I think it all fits.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So the one thing I noticed that, and I want to thank you also. There have been occasions where I've actually reached out to you because I've gone down some sort of rabbit hole with regard to some aspect of the pandemic and the vaccine and how COVID, what it does. And you've answered me. So I just want to thank you for helping me keep my head on straight. I actually went down there was a theory about if you don't aspirate on the injection and it goes into your bloodstream, that bad things will happen, and that's why young men were getting the enlarged heart, inflamed heart. And then you asked me, well, why is it only affecting young men or boys? And then I just went, poof, you just you cut through and you're like Occam's razor. And I'm just wondering, I mean, because it sounds like your development epistemologically started at a very young age in detective work and solving problems and thinking about these very, very large issues, long-term issues when you were very young. But I'm wondering if there were any of Ayn Rand's works that kind of reaffirmed that for you, or perhaps helped you out with that.
Well, I think all of them. I think all of them do, because I think that one of the ways that I can think clearly about problems or think about how to categorize issues all really comes from the objectivist epistemology of learning to think in principles and to think long range and to really think in essentials, so that you don't mistake superficial similarities. You know the difference between correlation and causation. You understand what has to be at play, that contradictions can't exist. All of that kind of stuff helps a lot with when you're trying to think through really hard problems and look through data or understand what's going to happen. I think it's general good thinking skills that are necessary in epidemiology or in any field. And I think it's probably not one single thing that did it, but probably all of it, and automatizing it and thinking and going through it over and over again. And I think the idea of integration, I think, is one that's really important. That being able to find ways things fit together and understand how all knowledge is kind of connected. That's very important, because I think it helps me to think through things that are going on with COVID and relate to the things that happened during H1N1, or to think about just to be able to think more comprehensively. And I think that's probably the thinking skills that I sort of absorb from the epistemology, rather than one single work. It's just the idea of watching a mind go through something like that when you're reading an article, for example, on something going on in the 1960s, to or reading more direct things like in ITOE or OPAR, where you're actually seeing that kind of being told to you didactically.
Yes. Any particular? I know you liked all of Ayn Rand's works. Any particular scene or character or anything inspiring that pops out at you right now?
For favorites.
I
mean, there's a lot of things that I think are interesting. I think, obviously the scene in the Fountainhead with the boy on the bicycle in the Monadnock Valley, that scene is really, I think is important. And I sort of have some kind of, the idea that he gave the boy the courage to face a lifetime. That I think is something that really resonates with me, because I spent a lot of time at the Center for Health Security with D.A. Henderson, the man who eradicated smallpox. And one of my last, before he died in 2016, and one of the last times I saw him, he was in the hospital, and out of nowhere, he was sitting there with his son, and he said, I read everything you write, and you really get it. You get it in a way that most people don't, or you get everything. And I thought, I didn't think he was going to die at that point. But then afterwards, I reflected on it. I think he was giving me the confidence to face a lifetime. So that scene continues to resonate with me because of that experience I had with D.A. Henderson, who I wish was here to deal with this pandemic. But that's one of my favorite scenes. I think a lot of the scenes in Atlas Shrugged, there's so many of them. I'm trying to, one of the ones I like is when they're going to do the ride on Reardon Metal, and all of these people volunteer to be on that first train. That's a scene I like as well. I also like, for some reason I like the scene, the last scene of Atlas Shrugged with Eddie Willers, where he's kind of saying that where you can't start the engine, and
don't let it go.
Yeah, that scene as well. And he says, from the best within me, that kind of thing. That statement, I think that's something I like as well, because I took it a weird way, because when I would take tests in medical school, I would say in my head, from the best within me, and I would just try and ace the test as best I could. Those are some of my favorites. There's lots of them. I haven't really thought through but those are the ones that come to mind first, which probably means they're probably the most important ones.
Oh, that is such a enriching experience that you had with the one gentleman who developed the vaccine for smallpox.
Well, not that he did the eradication, the eradication program. He's the
the eradication program. Thank you. Yes, I mean that's wow. what enriching life experiences. All right, now, in the future, do you plan on writing a book about maybe your experiences? Because it sounds like there is a lot of inspirational richness that you can perhaps pass along.
Not necessarily about my direct experiences. I'm not someone who's in the field, so it's not going to be something like that. Even though I do take care of patients, I was in Haiti after the earthquake doing stuff, but I haven't been, in the field in an Ebola outbreak or anything of that sort. But I am planning to. I've been working on a book basically since the Ebola epidemic in 2013, 2014, just my thoughts on infectious disease. I had an excerpt of it published in the Atlantic back in 2016, but it's kind of stalled and it's gone up and down. But we've redone a lot of it now after COVID. We'll see what happens. It's very difficult to write a book and to get all of that out there, but I've got more than it's more than a skeleton. It's basically done, but I just need to think about how I want to publish it, what I want it to do. But I write a lot of op-eds, but that's my idea, is to put all of my thinking on infectious disease topics into a book that's accessible to the regular science interested person, as well as to somebody in the field that just wants to think a little bit or just think a little bit deeply about some of the issues I bring up.
Yeah, that sounds like you would have more than enough material for a book on what epidemiology is and how it's done and what your experiences have been. Outstanding. Just a moment, while we are almost 20 minutes in, just real quick, because we have a few super chats. We need to acknowledge that. Thank you, Mary Aline, for chiming in. We appreciate that. Jeff Bannister is in from Canada as well, and Enric Teller. And they're just contributing, no questions. I think you are carrying that ball just fine for them, but thank you for contributing. Anybody else has any questions, feel free to enter them in the super chat. Those contributions do go to the Ayn Rand Center UK. If you want to contribute further, become a member. Join in, aynrandcenter.co.uk. Link will be posted into the chat shortly. So. Yes.
So now we've talked about the kinds of inspirational things that you've garnered from Ayn Rand and from her fiction and everything. And I know this, I can only imagine, maybe it hasn't been, maybe this last couple of years hasn't been quite tough for you, and you've just kept your Sherlock detective hat on. You kind of pushed through and you've answered the questions, and you've gone on, you were saying in previous interviews with Kira Peikoff that, you went on all the shows on both sides of the spectrum and made sure that everybody got the correct information. But yeah, I just want to say I'm glad that you have Ayn Rand and maybe some other inspirational, kind of refueling sources that I don't know. Do you have?
I guess that's the question.
That's the question.
Where do you get fuel from when folks say things or do things that have got to be a little discouraging?
Well, I think it's just thinking about what I'm trying to accomplish here, and the fact that we're in a pandemic and this is something I trained for. And no one ever said it was going to be an easy thing. There was misinformation during polio outbreaks. There was misinformation during 1918. So you'd be facing a lot. And when you make yourself a public figure and you're on television, you have to sort of know that that's going to come with all the threats and all of the emails and disturbing messages that you get on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I try to refuel just by, just the normal things of watching television, watching movies, just reading, just trying to remember that, sometimes I just try to kind of reaffirm my commitment to infectious disease. So I had to recertify in infectious disease, and going through all of that kind of brought back the love of it, just because you have to study for the test. Going through all of that was actually, it's kind of not really changing what I'm doing, but I'm actually looking at it from a different angle. I'm not dealing with the pandemic issues, but I'm just kind of delving back into infectious disease. And that actually itself is refueling, because it brings you back to why you started, like what you love about the field. And I also, I see patients on the side too. So that also gives me a break from pandemic stuff in the sense that I'm not talking on television, writing op-eds or dealing with meetings about the pandemic, but that I'm actually taking care of patients. And that also, even if they are COVID patients, that's still, and it's still pandemic related stuff, it also refuels you, because you got to kind of see where the rubber meets the road when you're in the hospital taking care of patients as well.
In that regard, that would have been the next question, which is, as you see the pandemic finally eventually start to wind down or make that move from being a pandemic to simply an endemic disease, which we have ways to work with. Question would be what's next, but I guess it's continue with your practice and maybe have more time with that, a little less time spent being a public figure, or do you think it'll continue as it is for a while?
I think COVID is still going to be a major issue. There's going to be a long tail of it, but I've always been half in the policy world with pandemics and half clinical. So there's so many things besides COVID-19 to worry about, like bird flu and other viruses, and making the country more resilient to the next infectious disease threat. So I'm already on to that now, trying to pivot into those fields. And I'm always looking to see what's going to be, what's new, what's up next on the horizon. So I think it's just more continuation. The intensity will go down because I won't be probably doing nearly as much media as I have for the last 2 years, but I'm still going to continue to think about infectious disease threats because they're not going to go anywhere. We live on a planet that teems with microorganisms. So it's only a matter of time before there's another infectious disease threat. And I think there is a window of opportunity to get this right because there's such a colossal failure with COVID-19 that there's a lot of work to be done now and a lot of advocacy to be done to make sure that this never, ever, ever happens again.
Yes. Well, thank you for your work. That's all I can say. That's amazing.
Now, in that regard, are you still, I shouldn't say still, are you hopeful that the applications of what has been developed for COVID-19 going forward, you mentioned earlier, for example, the AIDS virus, there's talk of using mRNA to address that. Are we still hopeful that those technologies are going to have an impact, and any thought of how soon?
Definitely. I do think that the greatest success story of the pandemic has been the mRNA vaccines, as well as the J&J vaccine, which uses a similar vector, a different vector, not an mRNA, but uses another virus. But it's a different type of technology, a platform technology. So I think vaccine platform technologies have been the real success story. And they were something that we had talked about from a policy perspective. I actually wrote a big report on vaccine platform technologies just prior to the pandemic, saying that they were really going to change the face of how we dealt with infectious disease outbreaks. And they really, really excelled beyond expectations during COVID-19. So I think that there will be a lot of cascading positive impacts on developments for vaccines for other infectious diseases like RSV, like influenza, like HIV, like malaria, whatever it may be, because now this technology has proven that it works, and that's created a lower hesitancy to get into it. And so I think that we hopefully will get into kind of hopefully a golden age of vaccinology again, where we can tame many more of these infectious disease agents, as well as improve vaccines like the flu vaccine by using different technology. So I think that it's really limitless now. And companies like Moderna, BioNTech are really going to be in a position to help get us, to help put more infectious diseases in the history books.
Outstanding.
That's great. We do actually have a super chat.
That's true. We have Alex with 10 Swiss francs. Says, what do you think about the hypothesis that the COVID-19 virus escaped from gain of function experiments at a Wuhan laboratory? Do you have an opinion about that?
I think it's possible. We know that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was working with coronaviruses, that they were doing experiments, looking at infectivity and trying to understand what the host range was for certain coronaviruses. And we know that biosafety lapses occur. There was just a biosafety lapse in Taiwan where a person got infected with COVID. So there always is that I think that there is a possibility that could have happened. The other possibility is that it was an animal spillover event somewhere in China. We know it came from bats. We don't know the exact mechanism for how it got into humans. But I think the transparency issue in China is going to make it very hard to actually know one way or the other, because it's something that we know that the Chinese always lack transparency when it comes to infectious disease outbreaks. They did this with the first SARS. They themselves may not actually want to know the answer. So it's going to be very difficult. I think it's a possibility. And I think the natural spillover event hypothesis is also still a possibility. I don't think we have definitive evidence on either way, but it really behooves the Chinese government to be transparent, because we need to know what the origin of this virus was, because if it is from some intermediate animal between bats and humans, we need to know what that animal is, because we need to change our interactions with that animal. And if it was a lab spillover or a lab leak, we need to understand how that biosafety lapse happened, because there's many labs that work with lots of dangerous pathogens doing really vital research. And we want to make sure that best practices are universal, so we don't have these types of accidents. So I think it's really important to find the origin, but unfortunately, I think that the Chinese government and their lack of transparency has made it very, very difficult to get to the bottom of this.
Great.
I'm going to resist more COVID-19 questions.
Okay,
because
we have a wonderful question here from Jeff.
But real quick, I would say to Alex and anybody else with an interest in that question,
Right.
It's definitely an open question. I know less, obviously, than Dr. Adalja does, but if you listen to Yaron Brook's recent interview with Matt Ridley, who has co-authored a book on the subject, I think that's exactly the conclusion that he reaches, but with a lot of data. So that would be worth looking for, Alex. Look for Yaron Brook, Matt Ridley, most recent interview. Very good. We also have Jeff Bannister in the chat. 20 Canadian dollars set, and thank you from north of the border there, says, now, to totally change the subject, we didn't want to get too much into COVID. I have been stretching myself in literature with Lisa Van Dam's Read With Me app. She helps me understand it better. Do you spend much time reading classics?
I actually do the Read With Me app as well, but I do read classics. And I've been kind of rereading books I read in high school to sort of give myself a better, like the Scarlet Letter, things like that I read in high school that I didn't really have good appreciation for. But so, yeah, I do read classical literature, and I think the Read With Me app is great as a great way to do it.
Outstanding.
Now we have a couple more super chats that just came in. However, we only have about 3 more minutes on the clock, so I know that you need to get going at 6 o'clock. Before I touch on those, I just want to say thanks again for being a kindred with regard to old school punk rock, and I hope that maybe you're still skateboarding. Is that something that you still do?
I try to. I live in Pittsburgh, so it's kind of, the weather hasn't been good, and the indoor skate parks are often closed because of COVID. But yeah, I try to when I can, not as much as I want to. But I that's another way that I like to refuel. It's something that I've done since I was a little kid, and I continue to like it.
Yes. And by the way, I'm going to be in London with Robert at the ARC UK event, and I am going to be going to the Roundhouse. It used to be a concert hall, and that was the very first place that the Ramones performed in the UK, in London. So I'm going to get my picture and I'm going to send it to you because that is where
I think that has like an interesting story behind it, because I think that the Clash tried to come in. They tried to or the Sex Pistols of the Clash, they had the Ramones had to sneak them in. I think it's in there's a Ramones documentary called The End of the Century, where you talk about that episode. Yes, the Sex Pistols trying to meet the Ramones. That's the story.
All right. Well,
that's so great.
In the super chat, Anthony has a question. I don't know why he's asking you. If there's any chance you have the answer to this, why are UK politicians and Prince Harry pushing at the moment for everyone to have an HIV test? Any answer to that?
In general, from a public health perspective, we've been trying to make sure everyone knows their status for HIV, because there are maybe about 15% of people who are HIV positive who don't know, but they're responsible for a lot of the transmission events. So in general, with public health, we want everybody to get, as part of regular health maintenance, to get one HIV test, just so that you know their status. So we pick up some of those cases that are undiagnosed, so that we can link them to treatment, because otherwise they have a risk of spreading the disease and it progresses. So in general, yes, everybody should get, and I mean, it's just a normal thing to get an HIV test. And from a public health perspective, it's sort of one size fits all. Some people may not have risk factors for HIV, but that's a standard public health measure that's been around for several years.
Okay, good. Not something I had heard about. And then Michael Sanders in for $10 says, Dr. Adalja, suppose you take a healthy person in their 20s with no pre-existing conditions and feed him only Snickers bar and Coca-Cola. How long could he live? A few months or decades? Oh, that reminds me of that pseudo documentary somebody threw together where he only ate McDonald's for a while. I don't know why the question is raised, but do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know all of the ingredients in the Snickers bar, but you clearly need vitamin C and other vitamins that may not necessarily be in a Snickers bar. It's not just about calories. So there's also micronutrients and electrolytes It depends on how many, how much Diet Coke, how much Coke you drank to make sure you're, I don't know that you can come up with a good answer. I don't know that anybody could say how long someone could live like that.
I hope he's not asking for practical reasons. Don't do it, Michael. It's not
Don't
worth
do it.
it.
It's not worth it.
Well, we are reaching the top of the hour, and I know you have a budget for time. So we thank you very much for coming
Thank you, Amish.
and talking to us. Looking forward to talking to you, whether we run into you at ARCCon or OCon 2022.
We'll be at OCon. We'll hope to
Yes.
see you there.
Yeah,
Do
I should be at the second. I won't be at the UK.
Do you know if you'll be speaking at OCon?
I don't know yet. I think I was invited to. I have to think about what I want to talk about, but yeah.
Well, you will have fans rooting for you if you do, and not just the two of us, but given the chat as well. So thank you very much for being on Life on Earth. Boy, that was a quick half hour, wasn't it?
Yes.
And
Thank you.
we very much appreciate not just everything you do, but of course everything you do, but also just the opportunity to talk about Ayn Rand and skateboarding and punk rock. And maybe we can have that conversation again when
Yeah.
we have a little more time.
Yes, you're always welcome here.
But thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thank you, Amish.